Doctora Spohr, quien estas semanas ha sido entrevistada por numerosos medios de comunicación europeos, es autora de una docena de libros, entre ellos este, que les quiero mostrar. ¿Lo pueden ver? Después del Muro. Un libro que es producto de 12 años de trabajo, lo cual sin duda que le da un valor en sí mismo, y que además llegó a las librerías nacionales el año pasado, en 2021, bajo el sello Taurus, y cuya lectura ciertamente es tan oportuna como imprescindible. Le doy la bienvenida a la doctora Spohr. Muchas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación. Sabemos que ha estado muy ocupada con diferentes actividades académicas y también respondiendo preguntas y participando en entrevistas con muchos medios de comunicación. Y sobre todo porque además en Londres ya son las 9 de la noche. Desde ya, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos y por su tiempo.
Time as well.
Thank you very much for having me and for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to you in Santiago.
Entremos en materia. En pocos días esta guerra va a cumplir un mes. Y cada vez parece quedar más claro que esta operación militar a gran escala, iniciada por Rusia, ¿verdad?, no es algo que fuese improvisado y que probablemente comenzó a planificarse en 2014, cuando Rusia anexó Crimea, o incluso antes. Hemos visto también que el gobierno ruso ha argumentado, ha defendido esta operación militar, hablando de la amenaza de la OTAN cada vez más cerca de sus fronteras, y la necesidad de la absoluta neutralidad de Ucrania en términos de no ingresar ni a la OTAN ni a la Unión Europea. En ese contexto, doctor Spohr, ¿cuál cree usted que es el verdadero objetivo que Vladimir Putin busca con esta ofensiva militar en contra de Ucrania?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question. I think it's very interesting. On the one hand, it is, of course, Putin's war against Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine. But I think on a second level, it's a war to challenge the order in Europe that has been created also under the aegis of the United States after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In other words, that post-war world with the liberal norms and values that we know. And on a larger scale, of course, it ties in with something we heard in 2019 when Putin, in an interview with the Financial Times, spoke about the liberal world order being obsolete, and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, speaking about Russia wanting to push for a post-West world order, whatever that may be, and we can perhaps look into that later on as well a little bit. And of course, in that bigger question over what kind of world order they want, that ties in, you know, with this great hatred for that term unipolarity, that sort of sense that somehow America triumphed at the end of the Cold War, that we began to speak of the unipolar moment, unipolarity at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And, you know, he talked a lot about that actually what he wanted to be recognized by the United States already in 2007 would be that the world was moving into a multipolar world, or the Chinese use the term polycentric world. And here we also see the sort of merger of the Russian revisionist path, especially under Putin, and the Chinese exit that from the Cold War, of course, was already different, because China had undertaken the Tiananmen Square massacre. The party had held onto power by using force, in contrast to the Gorbachevite policy of, you know, freedom of choice and the abolition of the Brezhnev doctrine when it came to Eastern Europe and Eastern European revolutions. And in that sense, China had taken a separate exit out of the Cold War, pursuing its one-party state, that authoritarian regime, while pressing on with lifting China out of, a socialist, developing country to a capitalist world economic power. And the ambition, as we have heard, of course, by 2050, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party, will be to be a world ordering power. And here we have this sort of awkward synergy and an awkward alliance emerging in terms of both the ambitions of the world order, but also in terms of, power politically challenging the United States between Russia and China. And to what extent that is stable, I know we will perhaps talk about that later on in the conversation. But now back to Europe. So and then I'm sort of coming all the way back into the Ukraine, of course. So as regards that European order, we must remember that after 1945 with the UN Charter, but then in the very specific European Cold War context, the Russians had been particularly keen, the Soviet Union, for the Helsinki Final Act. That is a very important, founding document, if you so want, from 1975, where principles of how, in an organization, the only pan-European organization where the Soviet Union, America, Canada, and all the European countries sat together, they agreed on certain principles, including human rights. But above all, what the Soviet side was pressing. So while the Western side was pressing perhaps more on the human rights and the hope that one day East and Western Europe could find a way to come together again, the Soviets had tried to treat this as a kind of peace treaty, a de facto peace settlement for the borders in Europe. And that's why they stressed the inviolability of boundaries. The West stressed more the aspect of self-determination and also stressed more the freedom of choice of alliance. And why do I bang on about something that's from 1975? Because that, of course, got renewed in the Charter of Paris at the next summit. In between, you had follow-on conferences. And in 1990, in November, that got furthermore, stressed. And then once the CSCE turned into the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation. And that has fallen completely by the by in this context once Russia started the war against Ukraine. Because actually, here are the principles that should have safeguarded the territorial integrity of the Ukraine under something that, all sides had signed. Everybody had agreed. But that normative order is completely now under threat. And what else can I say about this? Well, if you think about in the post-Yeltsin era when Putin came to power, he first emerged with the Millennium Manifesto. He talked about Russian values, the strength of the Russian state, where somebody like him was sort of a servant to that state. But it also entailed, of course, in terms of Russian status, the element that one day Russia should be again recognized as a great power on the international platform. One of the countries at the top table, a co-equal of the United States. That was sort of the ambition. And in his first phase of the presidency, we saw perhaps more of, consolidation, political consolidation at home in the aftermath of a more chaotic, more liberal Yeltsin period, considering the economic chaos, again, also the consolidation of the economic sphere. But we had, even in those first 8 years already, pointing to, as I said, that statement, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe for Putin was the collapse of the Soviet Union. It wasn't World War I or World War II. That was a statement also made at that Munich Security Conference. Once more, first made in 2005, and then that it was actually a humanitarian catastrophe, a humanitarian tragedy, he said, for all the Russians outside, strictly speaking, the Russian Federation terrain. And that's important because when the Soviet Union collapsed, these newly independent states, including Ukraine, became called already in the Yeltsin period that near abroad. Here you sort of see also, this democratization came also nationalism and that sense, and from Putin's sense in particular, then, 15 years on, that the Russian minorities in the republics, in the new states outside Russia, need to be somehow brought back into the fold again. Russia needs at minimum a sphere of influence. And ever since he came back after his swapping of the seats with Medvedev, we have seen the focus on the foreign policy and in particular the consolidation of Russia's positioning in European and world politics. and also in respect to, looking to where, tie again the neighbors closer to Russia. And that goes for Belarus. There was this great sense, that somehow Ukraine was turning too much to the West, and what was happening to especially more Russian-dominated areas, because obviously Ukraine has also sizable Russian minorities. And perhaps a sort of final point to make in regard to the question that you asked. You also asked about, Russia's sense of encirclement by NATO. I really want to push back on that, because I want to remind you that the fact that NATO survived the Cold War was actually a win-win compromise solution for the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Britain, the victor powers of World War II, to resolve the German question. Everybody in Europe, including much smaller neighbors in East and West, worried about if Germany unified after the Berlin Wall, how would that Germany be secured? And initially one thought there might be different models how Europe may unify, and then maybe in 10, 20 years' time, Germany will unify in a uniting Europe where Soviet Union and France and everybody's living in a common European home, or a CSCE or something, and in that Germany can be unified. But within weeks, the actual developments were that, basically West Germany would absorb East Germany because East Germans wanted the Deutschmark, and they kept pouring into West Germany, and the cleanest solution for the Germans that was found, and what the East Germans voted for in the first election, was to join West Germany. And that West Germany was already a member of EU, or the EC, that was moving towards becoming a more deep EU, and in NATO. And even from the Soviets' perspective, after a while, of course, with checkbook diplomacy, with establishing trust, considering also Gorbachev had serious domestic problems at home, they came up with this 2+4 treaty to resolve finally the German question, that the Germans would never ask for any territories again, that it would be the Germany of East and West together with Berlin, and that would be it. One wouldn't go back to Kaliningrad or Silesia or Pomerania. The borders would be where they were. And that Germany would remain a member of NATO, albeit now with a bigger territory. And that Eastern Germany's territory would be getting a special status. No nuclear weapons by Western powers stationed in East Germany, and no foreign troops permanently stationed in East Germany. So that territory was always in some ways of a different type in terms of how Article 5 could be applied and then defended, because it has a different status of how troops and military materiel, and especially nuclear arms, are precisely not deployed. There's a delimitation. And when other Eastern European countries and the Balts pressed for joining NATO, that wasn't because NATO or America was on an expansionist drive. In fact, you have to remember, when Clinton came to power, he said, it's the economy, stupid. There was problems in Haiti. America was trying to resolve the civil war in Somalia and the famine. Russia and trying to expand NATO was not the most important thing. In fact, there was the Yugoslavian war that kept pulling the Americans back into Europe, because the Europeans weren't able to deal with the war, sending into genocide on their southern frontier. And then on top of that, given the chaos in Russia in 1993, when Yeltsin was seriously challenged by the parliament, by a right-wing and ultra-nationalist rise in the elections, out of a sense that people who were withdrawn with the Red Army from Eastern Europe felt that Russia was humiliated. Yeltsin's democratic ambitions in some ways, were undermined by these nationalist voices. And that instability emboldened Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, the Balts. They thought, we are not never going to look for security guarantees from Russia. And we have just left there. And it's not going well, then it's going potentially in an authoritarian revisionist direction. It's very unstable. We better turn to the West. And the EU, that will take a long time for us to fulfill all the criteria. Maybe we start pressing more to get into NATO. And it's in those auspices, under the pressure from the Eastern Europeans to join the institutional West, that NATO then responded. And that's why I really want to push back against the Putin narrative that has been now repeated for 20 years and that was used to justify you know, also the aggression in Ukraine. It was one of the justifications. He sold himself, his entourage, the Russians and the world, that the West is an empire of lies because Russia got betrayed, that NATO would never enlarge. No, those things were all about what would happen with East German terrain. Whatever he refers to in 1990 related especially to the solution of Germany. And that got signed in a treaty by Mikhail Gorbachev. And what the Eastern Europeans did subsequently was always dealt with Russia separately, not least through the NATO-Russia Founding Act. So we must not fall for this betrayal narrative or this encirclement narrative, or that we have created lies on which to conduct the policy. And I really want to stress this, that this is, you know, the outcome of research I've conducted in the archives over many years.
O sea, en ese sentido, Vladimir Putin lo que hace es una interpretación antojadiza de un episodio histórico, es decir, la idea de que cuando se reunifican las dos Alemanias, la OTAN plantea no un despliegue hacia el este, pero no necesariamente se refería a los países de Europa del Este.
Yes, I mean, the German Unification Treaty and the debates Putin refers to, were all, when you look at the context of the documents, about Germany and the East German terrain. And when the Red Army would be withdrawing from East Germany, it was a period up to 1994. Now, if you think back, 4 years is a long time. In 4 years, a lot can happen. Think about from 2022 to 2018, what we have experienced in 4 years. Pre-COVID, COVID lockdowns, a complete world shutdown, war.
Ciertamente. Me gustaría consultarle, Estados Unidos en noviembre del año pasado puso este tema sobre la mesa, públicamente denunció que Rusia tenía planes para invadir a Ucrania a mediados de enero. Y esa fecha se fue moviendo en el tiempo hasta llegar al 24 de febrero. ¿Qué opina usted respecto al momento que Putin elige para lanzar esta ofensiva militar? ¿Por qué elige este año? ¿Por qué no lo hizo tal vez durante la pandemia? Ciertamente también tuvo que enfrentar ese desafío enorme. ¿Por qué no lo realizó, por ejemplo, en los años de Donald Trump? ¿Y por qué ahora lo vemos durante el comienzo o el segundo año de la presidencia de Joe Biden?
I have to speculate a little bit because obviously I can't look into Putin's head. But my impression is that, I mean, I would argue with you actually and say, why he should have done it with Trump. But of course, Russia had its own problems, you know, with the COVID. That of course brought extra uncertainty. There was also uncertainty, I suppose, in the Russian-Chinese relationship, also in relation to, you know, how this COVID was managed, also within China. That question of how that rapprochement worked. But then I think also if you look at Europe, the world looked a little bit different. You know, Angela Merkel was in power, Macron was still quite far away from his elections, British politics looked different. So I think this year is interesting in different ways. We can on the one hand think, if you think about the territory that he might be interested in as he challenges that European order in territorial ways, you know, it might be Belarus, which already has lots of Russian soldiers there. Ukraine, what about Moldova? What about Georgia? You know, if you think of non-NATO countries, these are pressure points where already, you know, there is, of course, territorial issues, Transnistria, South Ossetia, and so forth. And of course, a very tight relationship with Lukashenko in Belarus. Then if we think about this sort of core of countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, if you think of Soviet history, you know, the Slavic core countries, then if you look at the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922, and you think about how Putin always plays up, you know, the Victory Day parade, how he played up with 1991, 2021, you know, 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this has to be, you know, somehow redeemed. So when you look actually of how he perhaps looks at these issues and what kind of legacy he wants as he needs to secure, his own future, potentially with somebody replacing him at some point. Because, if you feel that your own physical powers, say, are waning, then you also must consider who will succeed you, that you can, continue in a happy retirement with a legacy left that puts you in the history books, which clearly matters to him. He will be 70 this year. So I think there's a lot of different things we can speculate on and imagine that, if you get yourself into this mindset that at some point you're going to challenge what you perceive as this Western encirclement and the Western threat, and of course the vexing thing from his perspective, that the Western societal model just seems to be more attractive because everybody chooses that and not aligning with Russia. So if you have that really big frustration building up and you want to turn it over and prove yourself as a warrior man, a warrior politician, not just a politician, and you really want to, with maximal positioning, push through, then you could say, based on all the things I said, plus the fact that Angela Merkel left, and a few days later, Putin pushes on these security guarantees, especially to the United States, all the security guarantees he wanted in writing, which is effectively over the heads of the Europeans when you ask for these guarantees from the United States, not just of NATO. Secondly, Macron was having elections coming up. I mean, actually, this is war already drawing out. He's making Macron a gift. Macron is very likely to be re-elected because he can play, great president. These things actually matter. We have a buffoon in the perspective of Putin with Boris Johnson in Britain. And of course, they have already given warnings to the British, say, with, the Novichok attack over the Skripal case, the polonium attack. There have been all these sort of awkward uses of weaponry on British soil. So, Russia has left little markers there. So this was in many ways, at an unstable moment. You get a new German chancellor of a three-party coalition where potentially there might be, especially in the Social Democrats, a pro-Russian side. So maybe this is a good moment to just go that extra mile, especially when you can also go to these Olympics in Beijing, have a bit of a chat with Xi, put out some markers over that, amazing friendship, a 5,000-word document that you can cooperate in all areas. And in that sense, challenge world order, challenge European order, and then go to war. And I think all these things appear to have come together in this moment. Where he miscalculated, I think, is that he really thought he can sell it as a special operation and it's done and dusted in 3-4 days. But it hasn't come to that. And so now we are looking at a completely different scenario of how this may play out and what he has to do at home. Because the truth is, if you go in with something in maximal position, you push yourself also in a corner if it goes badly. And once you start a war, you can never know how it really starts panning out because you cannot predict how everybody else is reacting. And I think he's really shocked by how Europe has stood together. The Euro-Atlantic community stands together over the sanctions, weapon deliveries, humanitarian aid, but especially the sanctions regime on Russia. And of course, his own logistical problems when it comes to the armed forces. And never mind that Ukraine is defending tooth and nails its terrain. I think that he really believed that they will open up their arms to the Russians and happily become one Russian nation and state. He didn't want to understand that not only are big parts of Ukraine a real Ukrainian nation, but the Ukrainian state has formed its own identity over the last 30 years.
En ese contexto, bueno, hemos visto que Occidente, la comunidad internacional, ha respondido ante la invasión a Ucrania con sanciones económicas nunca vistas, inéditas. Asimismo, la OTAN ha sido muy clara en términos de decir que está dispuesta a defender a cualquiera de los países que la integran, ¿verdad?, en caso de que sea atacado por Rusia. Y al mismo tiempo hemos visto que Estados Unidos ha dicho constantemente que va a apoyar a Ucrania, pero que no va a enviar tropas, no va a enviar fuerzas militares a pelear en Ucrania. Muchos han interpretado esto como el intento de evitar una confrontación directa con Rusia y así evitar un escenario de tercera guerra mundial. ¿Será que Vladimir Putin lo interpreta de una manera distinta y que en el fondo lo que ve es una señal de debilidad de parte de Occidente?
I think probably Vladimir Putin thought that the West looked weak when he invaded Crimea and very little happened. I think now this is a different situation because now he has invaded, he is the aggressor. That has also come out at the United Nations, which is blocked now because, you know, one of the permanent members on the Security Council is the aggressor, so nothing works. You cannot resolve it with resolutions, you cannot exert pressure. But I also do think that if we look at it from the perspective of the NATO and the United States, if you are true to your principles, and I now want to really leave out, you know, the Iraq War of 2003, because that regime change policy on the back of September 11 and war on terror, that actually muddied the waters. But if you hold on to the principles that NATO is a defensive alliance and that you defend your territory up to your border, then of course your main point is to strengthen that eastern flank and to defend. And all you can do is to support the country that has been attacked, which is not a NATO member state, with material that they may use and need to defend themselves. But it's not for the Americans or the Poles or the Germans to put soldiers, boots on the ground in Ukraine. Absolutely not. And I think that would be wrong, given actually what kind of alliance NATO is and what its task is. And simply because since already on day 4, and that was actually quite shocking, even if the Russians used the word deterrent, they said that they were making their nuclear weapons ready. And again today, we have heard, you know, from Medvedev, that, you know, they're ready to potentially use nuclear weapons. And let's say they were just to use short-range nuclear weapons. If there was a nuclear weapons exchange, then these things can so rapidly escalate. It's absolutely terrifying, because then you have pitted the Western nuclear powers, including the United States, against Russia. And that is not something that is just some small theater warfare. And I think with that background in mind, we have to understand, however frustrating it may seem for, you know, any Western country and for the United States. By Western country, I mean the countries that of course are around the Ukraine, that you can't physically go there and help. But you have to really think about what are your own responsibilities to your own defense and what are the norms and principles guiding you within your alliance. And there are certain things you cannot overstep, and certainly not when it has already, it's simply started out with a war of narratives creating completely different realities. And I think if we stick with our realities, then the alliance goes up to the border where it is. All one can do is to supply material so that the Ukrainians feel they are supported in being able to defend themselves, which is what they're doing. And the question is, you know, how many problems will the Russians have? How will this play out?
Precisamente hoy, el secretario general de la OTAN, Jens Stoltenberg, anunció que la Alianza Atlántica va a reforzar su contingente militar en Bulgaria, Hungría, Rumania y Eslovaquia. En ese sentido, ¿usted cree que Rusia podría intentar ir más allá de Ucrania y efectivamente atacar a algún país vecino que forma parte de la OTAN?
I think in the first instance, I would imagine that in some ways Russia and Belarus are already very close. And that's, of course, you know, very close to Kaliningrad, which is already Russian. And then, you know, if his aim is to really incorporate Ukraine into Russia in one way or another, either completely denuding it militarily, neutralizing it, changing population, shifting populations, whatever the means, but really draw that into the Russian sphere at minimum, then I think if he were to test resolve, I don't think it's going to be Romania or some of the other countries, Poland that you mentioned. I think he would think that the weakest point would be either to try you know, a very, very strong defensive country such as Finland, or if it's the NATO, then the eastern border of Estonia. Because if it is about the sort of sense that other countries that are not perceived as Russia friendly, and they have given us this list who's no longer considered Russia friendly because they have, even if they just have military equipment from somewhere else. And of course, smaller countries will buy their military equipment from other places, especially if you're an EU or NATO member or both. You will buy from your allies who are producing some that you may not have, or something even better. Then I think the places that are closest to, for example, St. Petersburg would be higher on the list than, say, Poland or Romania or Slovakia or any of those Central European states. Yes. And also because we need to think about it in terms of size and what kind of geography is there. And we must also remember that, of course, when the Baltic states joined NATO, there was always this question, how defensible is that particular territory? They're very small countries. There aren't any natural defenses simply by the way, what nature offers, let's say. That position is also slightly different. Even if Finland has a very long border with Russia, there's many problematic areas depending on the seasons. But for the Baltic states, they're much more vulnerable. And that's why we are seeing what the Secretary General has announced and what has been going on for a while, more troops and foreign troops being sent to support the national troops and the forces in the NATO countries on the eastern flank. And I think what we will see over time, because of this aggression, that the concession that those new NATO members, of course, made so that Russia would accept that enlargement, namely that there wouldn't be permanent bases for foreign troops, that may change over time. And certainly the presence, even if it's just for 3 months and rolling, and why am I mentioning this? Because if you have, say, 500 British or 500 German or 300 Americans going to Estonia for 3 months, they may train interoperability, they may have a nice experience in a new country, but they don't really get to know every nook and cranny in the place. That is not the same as when you're located somewhere, say, for 5 years and you really get to know the terrain. You see, that is, of course, what we see with Ukraine when they defend their own country. They know every little thing. They know every street in their cities. That's why when you are defending, it's much harder for the aggressor to read you because they are on hostile soil that they don't know.
Pensando en ese contexto de países amenazados, hay dos países que tienen una situación muy similar a la de Ucrania. Uno es Moldavia, que desde hace décadas tiene que convivir con un movimiento separatista prorruso en Transnistria. Y también está Georgia, que también tiene una situación similar, esta vez con dos territorios que son Abjasia y Osetia del Sur. ¿Estos dos países podrían ser opciones más factibles de ser invadidos por Rusia, precisamente por el escenario tan similar al de Ucrania que ambos tienen?
I think that, depending how far his territorial interests go, those are two other weak points, because these are former Soviet socialist republics that became independent, and where already there have been issues over borders and terrains with Russia. And in the Georgian case, of course, already Russia had an allergic reaction when Georgia had said in 2008 that they would also like to one day join NATO. So, we don't know, because we haven't had a declaration really, how maximalist when it comes to challenging the United States presence as a European power, in other words, America's presence in Europe as it emerged post-war, as it emerged after 45. You have to remember, America has been in Europe since 1945. But what is really a key difference, which is one of the things I tell my students, you must always remember, after 1945 and the Cold War, and also in the last 30 years, America is in Europe an empire by invitation. Russia, or the Soviet Union with the Warsaw Pact, was an empire by imposition. It foisted on those countries that Warsaw Pact alliance. That's why we had these revolutions to break free from it. And you have seen it again over the last 30 years. And at the moment, I cannot predict how far Putin wants to go with his sphere of influence, because he feels that he clearly needs a buffer beyond Russia, a buffer of area with Russian population, so that he feels secure from whatever he feels is the threat. And of course he says, oh, you know, under Napoleon, the French came, and then later the Germans came, and there's always somebody coming. Of course, not since 1945. And of course, we could look at Germany as, you know, really a successful story of a country defeated and divided and having had to relearn completely how to build up a democracy, because, you know, the Weimar Republic experience was very short-lived. You could say, you know, that is a country anchored in particular institutions. It has learned its lessons. And the French and the Germans are in the European Union. France is not going to invade Russia tomorrow. So I think that, you know, in terms of what Russia thinks, how far it needs its sphere of influence to go, it's difficult to predict, but Moldova and Georgia are definitely weak points.
Hace algunas horas se confirmó que el presidente Joe Biden viaja a Bruselas, en donde se va a reunir con la OTAN, se va a reunir con el G7 y también con los principales mandatarios de la Unión Europea para analizar la situación, la crisis que está en desarrollo, y posteriormente va a viajar a Polonia. En este escenario vemos que hay dos grandes actores, que es la OTAN y la Unión Europea, y que son actores independientes. ¿Usted cree que podría generarse, a partir de la invasión a Ucrania, un proceso que acercara mucho más a la OTAN, que es una alianza militar, con la Unión Europea, que es una alianza de corte político y comercial, pensando en un futuro incierto, tal vez en que debieran enfrentar nuevas amenazas?
In some ways, I think they're already facing the threats together, because you see, if you look at Germany's response, which really was reactive, it took a while coming, but when it came, it was very strong, you know, to raise Germany's GDP spending to the NATO 2% threshold, to put 100 billion euros into the defense budget, to buy, you know, new fighter jets from the United States. Here you see one of the founder countries and one of the key in the tandem, Franco-German tandem, that seemed to be quite lax in the recent past. You know, where was Europe going? It was all, you know, it was all somehow stalling. And now there is a sort of sense that in front of this common threat, even the European Union is completely reinvigorated, because, you know, even in this context of 30 years of the Berlin Wall, you know, even in Germany or Poland or Hungary especially, you know, there was a great reckoning, quite negative looking back. Oh, we have given up too much sovereignty to this Brussels. You know, we Poles, we Hungarians, we fought, we got our independence back and we immediately gave everything to Brussels. That's completely disappeared now. Now one is standing together in the EU and in NATO, and in some interesting ways, you know, this economic sanctions package, that's really where you see, you know, the power of the EU. And that's actually something for China to consider, depending how they behave, because, you know, the EU is China's biggest trading partner, you know, if you think in real financial terms. So that is really, really hurting when the EU puts out the sanctions. But of course, in terms of offering that nuclear umbrella beyond the national force de frappe of France, and you know, the British nuclear deterrent for Britain, it is the American umbrella that is there really for everybody, and that is what the EU cannot provide. And that's why you see, you know, the security situation changing entirely in Europe through the war. Why suddenly Sweden and Finland, who are of course already very interoperable with NATO quietly, because, you know, Finland, for example, never gave up conscription, never gave up on a strong defense. They're as close as NATO as you can be, but I think now may be the moment when they think this is the possibility, or the moment when within a very short period of time you just join the alliance, just to have that security of Article 5 where really everybody stands together. The EU has a similar article, but the EU has no, you know, organizational framework in the same way as NATO has in terms of military chains of commands and how, you know, everything is working together on the military side. And the WEU, the thing that the French have been sort of pressing, you know, under a French leadership, something more European, is not something that I think is viable in a conflict like we currently see with a war of aggression. Perhaps, you know, with, you know, peacekeeping or peace enforcement missions somewhere else, smaller missions where Europe wants to act on its own, but not when they're looking at a continent at war as we haven't seen it since the Second World War. That's where the NATO comes into play. And I think that's where, especially also for smaller countries, but also for Germany to show its loyalty to be in a club and to be bound in so that its neighbors are never worried about what Germany is doing. That is everything helping for the stabilization of the European continent. But it's also an acknowledgement that that stability is tied up with that America is that empire by invitation. The Europeans want the Americans in there, but they're happy to step up more to the plate than they perhaps recently were when they were a bit too much perhaps relying and just leaning back and saying, well, the Americans sort it out, but a lot what they do we don't really like, let's see. But that's changed because the nature of war is actually more like that old-fashioned war of, you know, conventional forces rolling in.
En este contexto de guerra en Ucrania, que ha afectado ciertamente al sistema político internacional completo, hay un actor muy importante que ha mantenido una posición bastante ambigua, y que es China. Beijing se ha negado, por ejemplo, a condenar la invasión y al mismo tiempo a respaldar las sanciones impuestas por Occidente en contra de Rusia. Da la sensación de que esta cercanía, esta alianza entre China y Rusia se ha comenzado a volver un poco incómoda para el gobierno chino. ¿Qué papel ve usted que está jugando China en términos concretos? ¿Está tratando de tener una injerencia real en la resolución del conflicto o está buscando una posición que le permita salir bien parada de esta crisis internacional?
I think China is very interesting, and they're looking on, of course, you know, they present themselves at the moment as a sort of Asian big power with their Silk Road projects and so forth. And they also invest in Russia so they can get the raw materials that they need. After all, they have a huge population. They need to keep living standards going. They need to keep the economy going. And of course, they would not like to be on the receiving end of such sanctions, as I just explained, you know, but if the EU made sanctions on China, we can see that the Chinese have quite happily tolerated what Putin is doing, and they probably do so with view to their own interests as regards Taiwan, and when they consider, you know, their sphere of influence in the Pacific. But I don't think it's just, you know, an axis of the two authoritarian regimes because they really like each other or because they're equal, because I actually think that China is not seeing itself as equal with Russia. China wants to be that world leading, that world ordering power, the power that may have come late to the table if you think about, you know, the history from the 19th century onwards and who were the big powers and especially the two superpowers in the 20th century. And that's why China says, you know, all that order since 1945 doesn't suit us, because if we become a world ordering power and if we challenge the United States, we want to rewrite the rules. And so Russia is perhaps, and what Russia is doing, more an interesting tool to get to that post-West world order, to get to a world order where it's not about, you know, rules of governance, of liberalism, of values, of the freedom of speech, of multi-party states. You know, democracy is messy, you know, and it's not always simple, and bad things can happen. But the point is that, you know, if you look, for example, what's happening in Russia now with the complete censorship. I mean, some Russians that I know are saying, you know, this is almost like turning Russia into North Korea. It's going back to the Stalinist age. This is not about, you know, old socialist modernization models or anything. This is, you know, crude power applied and silencing people for a group of a few who are trying to rule and who are getting all the money, and now they're also involved in a war. It's not like the Russian population is gaining anything from this. On the contrary, they're the ones who are suffering the worst, not the oligarchs. But I think China, in that sense, is playing a very, very interesting game. It will be actually unfortunate from China's perspective if Russia does badly, because for the moment, that is, you know, a nice way to keep the Americans busy and China can work out what it wants to do elsewhere when it wants to challenge the United States. Ultimately, I think the Chinese want to challenge the Americans. I think the Chinese are not, Russia is the biggest country in terms of geography, in terms of reach, from the Baltic Sea to the Bering Strait to the Pacific. But if you think of the amount of population, if you think of the tiny size of the GDP, if you think about that productivity, of course, the competitor for China is the United States and the Euro-Atlantic combination, if you so want. And they also stand for a particular way of a world order and of a thinking and of types of societies that the Chinese want to challenge and want to undermine. And I think that's important to see. And we shouldn't, forget that, even if we see, Xi and Putin shaking hands and stuff. That was quite convenient, and, Olympics have often in the past, in history, served for onsets of wars in different ways, especially when Russia is involved. But I think China has much more longer-term ambitions, and we need to keep an eye on that.
Claramente, la guerra en Ucrania marca un punto de quiebre, un punto de inflexión en términos históricos. Hace mucho tiempo que se habla ya de que el mundo ha ido avanzando hacia una nueva guerra fría, una segunda guerra fría. En ese aspecto, lo que ha ocurrido con Ucrania es el punto a partir del cual el orden mundial vigente en los últimos 30 años, que usted aborda precisamente en su libro, ¿verdad?, la construcción del mundo, del orden mundial post-Guerra Fría, entre el 89 y el 92, está definitivamente el mundo entrando en un nuevo orden mundial. Estamos realmente en una segunda Guerra Fría, con similitudes con la anterior o con reglas propias. Y una siguiente pregunta, este orden mundial nuevo, a diferencia de la Guerra Fría, que era un orden mundial bipolar, ¿es un orden o va a ser un orden tripolar, en donde veremos interactuando fundamentalmente a Estados Unidos, Rusia y China?
Well, I think actually that in some ways we have already moved, in terms of what you asked me at the very end, into something that is more multipolar. I mean, we are looking at, a Russia that has challenged by the sheer use of force, the military power that, before that there was almost like an unspoken thing that peace at any cost when it comes especially to involvement of nuclear powers. And nuclear powers pitted against other nuclear powers. But really matters what will happen to the world, even in sheer existence, that sort of nuclear Armageddon, of course, was a horror. So we have already moved into a multipolarity in that sense. But of course, if you think about economics or other aspects, yes, we can see maybe more the United States, in terms of military power projection or economic strength. But, we see already China, biggest navy, Pacific, and the Russians are playing now their game and seeing how far they can get in Europe and try and push America out. That is perhaps one other thing I want to highlight. What we are seeing with this war in Ukraine is all part of that changing European order by trying to push America out. And there was, of course, a hope that if you can influence Western elections and do this disinformation campaigning and stuff, there is anti-Americanism around, and that will sort of somehow help this along. That's a sort of one thing. I do not think that where we are moving is another Cold War. We must not forget the Cold War had as a sort of ordering form. It was a bipolarity up to a point frozen in time and frozen in place. Of course, we had hot wars in certain places, and those were horrible wars, and also the proxy wars. But that Cold War was on the one hand, a Cold War because you had that mutual assured destruction with intercontinental ballistic missiles, and in general with the nuclear weapons between the two superpowers who had also the blocs and who had client states. But furthermore, of course, it was also an ideological competition, and I think that got sort of forgotten a little bit on the way always. Not just politically ideological competition and what kind of governments do we have where, but about developmental models of modernization, the planned economy versus the market economy. And the market economy, of course, in all sorts of forms, perhaps later on, more neoliberalism on the United States side, but say in Europe, much more, a social economic welfare state model. something Gorbachev liked to call democratic socialism, but it wasn't socialism. It may have been social democratic, but it was, a welfare economy. So, but that was the market economy, the free market economy. And of course, that's also how world trade functioned, whereas the Soviet bloc was an autarkic bloc of itself, and so was China. It was a closed country in that sense. And they all opened out to world trade. They wanted to enter the World Trade Organization. So we had that economic opening out. So in the Cold War, this was completely separate. And what we learned, simply in terms of who could deliver for their societies, that the different types of Western models that we had, they brought prosperity to the societies and stability. And that's why in the people's minds it has to be political liberalization, in other words, democracy, together with market economy that creates prosperity. That's why it was believed that it has to go hand in hand. And that's why one believed if this was a triumph, then from the 90s onwards, dominoes would fall everywhere. People had forgotten that you could have fascist regimes and capitalism. You could have, as we now know, authoritarian, one-party, supposed communist regimes with capitalism, or whatever kind of authoritarian regimes you may have. But the Cold War had that element of ideological competition, and the Soviet model, the planned economy, simply could not deliver once you got away from just mass industrialization and raw materials and you got into this high tech, and that people want consumer goods, and that, high tech and that rapidly moving, modernized, digitized world, the plan simply could not deliver. And that's why it fell apart. That is, of course, a structural fault that was inherent in any kind of Soviet and Soviet puppet system all along, beyond the political questions over one-party states. And I think that's quite important. We're not going back to that. We're not going to go back into a Cold War with two powers and these elements I have just raised.
Muy claro, muy preciso. Me queda muy clara su posición al respecto. Ciertamente podríamos seguir conversando, hay muchas preguntas que todavía podríamos formular, pero sería muy importante también abrir un espacio para las preguntas de las personas que están conectadas a este conversatorio y que las han ido compartiendo durante esta sesión en el chat. Tenemos una selección de ellas. Quisiera partir con la primera. En su libro Después del Muro, la reconstrucción del mundo tras 1989, usted plantea la importancia de líderes como Bush, Thatcher, Kohl, Gorbachev y Mitterrand en la reconfiguración del mundo. En el caso de esta crisis, la crisis de Ucrania, ¿quiénes cree usted que serán los líderes que harán lo mismo de aquella época, pero ahora?
So the question was, because the translator and what you were saying went a bit of translator, could you just repeat quickly the last sentence you said? It was something about the comparison between Mitterrand, Bush and Gorbachev with where we are with leaders now. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay,
sí,
great.
¿quiénes serán los nuevos líderes que se harán cargo de esa reconstrucción?
Okay, yes. That depends when we can start with the reconstruction. I fear that both this Ukraine-Russia war might well be going on for quite a long time. Even if you were to get to an armistice or a ceasefire, these things are very complicated. To exit a war is very complicated, take months, can take even years. So by that point, especially in the various Western democracies, leaders may have had to go through elections, and that may have changed already. So I can't predict, but perhaps something that on the basis of my book, I would like to give away to you, in any case, as a really interesting and important message. When you look at what was really special in 89-91, is that, unlike in any other period in history, and again, what we are seeing today, that was a moment when an empire fell apart and the map in Europe was redrawn without bloodshed, without war. And that is really down to the leaders, because although you had a lot of people in the streets and protesting, the people in the squares, the men and women in the towers who had also networks, was also transnational. Above all else, it was international. They undertook diplomacy. They tried to create win-win situation. They really tried to move forward in a non-conflictual way and forge compromises. And that is the power of their leadership. whether they liked each other or whether they had different national interests, which certainly they did. I mean, Thatcher and Kohl really didn't get on, for example. But they were trying to move forward, trying to shape what they hope would be a better world, a more peaceful world, and they tried to do so peacefully. And what is so sad now, for me as a historian, is to see that somebody wants to vent their frustration by going for the maximal 19th century behavior, by just using sheer power and power politics, creating instability and unpredictability. And it will be very difficult, now that so much has been broken, to rebuild trust, to find even a common way. Where are your starting points, where you start to talk, that you even speak about the same reality? Because, of course, in Russia now, people get told about a completely different reality. They don't know about the war. They hear about the special operation. They hear that the West is squeezing them, destroying them, shattering them. Medvedev said this today. That is what the Russians hear, that the West started suddenly an economic warfare against them to destroy Russia and tear Russia into 5 pieces. The fact that they invaded the Ukraine is completely taken out of the picture.
Perfecto. Otra pregunta que nos han hecho llegar. ¿Cuánto depende el nuevo orden mundial del futuro político de Vladimir Putin?
Putin's political career, can you just repeat that? It's just because of the way the languages go on top of each other. Alberto, if you can just tell me quickly in English.
Okay. ¿De qué manera el orden mundial depende del futuro de Vladimir Putin en el poder en Rusia?
Yes, I think a lot will depend on Vladimir Putin staying in power and whether he can sell what is happening and how it will develop in Ukraine as a success, or whether it will be a failure and what will happen then. And that is very, very difficult to predict because, you know, will it come to a point where for the Russian, what's in the fridge trumps the television? In other words, when there's nothing to eat, will they go into the streets just like they did in 1917? Will they want to get rid of a leader who has brought, you know, really big problems onto them? Or could it be somebody in his entourage? Or will he be able to hang on? In which case, you know, seeing that so many Western leaders who kept traveling and traveling and traveling and sat in the Kremlin at this really long table, you know, in the last weeks ahead of the war, when actually the Kremlin spokesman Peskov kept saying, of course there's not going to be a war, we're never going to invade. Everybody feels lied to, and when you feel lied to, it's very, very difficult to move forward anyway, especially if that leader is going to staying in power. That can also become a really big problem. And I think a lot of how this will play out was what actually the Russians and also Putin's close advisors will do with Putin himself. Because so far, we must remember that his closest entourage clearly in the COVID bubble and in terms of how the power is centered around a very small group of people who will not say anything that Putin doesn't want to hear. And of course, that becomes an echo chamber, and it's really problematic. But I think we have to ask, and I haven't got an answer, but look, the defense minister Shoigu hasn't been heard and seen now already for, you know, a couple of weeks. So, you know, we have to ask who's in charge of the armed forces. It's very interesting how some people just at the moment are just not visible. You don't know what's happened to them.
Perfecto. Otra pregunta. ¿Están funcionando los organismos multilaterales de cooperación? ¿Qué está haciendo Naciones Unidas realmente?
I think the United Nations are very important, that it's still a forum where all the countries of the world can sit together. But I think in terms of dealing with this crisis, we can see that if one of the permanent members of the Security Council is the aggressor, it doesn't work. I mean, after all, the 5 who sit on the permanent council or are permanent members are the ones who defeated Nazi Germany and Japan. That's why Germany and Japan haven't got a seat on there. It's America, Russia, China, Britain, and France. But if one of them is the aggressor, the UN cannot function properly if they want to go along the UN Charter and deal with aggression, with war, with problems, because that one country can veto everything, which is exactly what we have seen with Russia. That's why the whole thing is so flawed. There wasn't possibility even to condemn properly via resolutions from the Security Council because Russia is the culprit. I mean, you know, if I was mischievous, I would say, well, maybe we need to take Russia out and put Germany in. But what I'm really trying to say here, this doesn't mean that the UN is completely in the bin. I think the UN is very important because you need fora that somehow you can get any kind of conversation going, because in diplomacy, however unpleasant certain compromises may be, if you cannot talk at all, then you're just entrenched and you're in a complete stalemate. And if you have no move, you need to find places with even the tiniest bit of movement to somehow get out of this impasse, especially when one side with maximalist positions, in this case the aggressor, is in the corner and has to find a way, or we have to find a way. Is there any kind of communication possible that you can pull him out of that corner to have any starting point? Because otherwise we're just sitting there incapable of ever coming together. And that it can surely not be, because we are still living on the same planet. We have still neighboring states. Somehow you have to get on. I mean, it's like the Siamese twins. They have the same pipe and they have to breathe. So this is a very difficult position, but I think in that sense, the UN still has an important place. But at the moment we can see that structurally it's really struggling, and it's almost as if it's from another era, because of course Russia was one of the victor powers against Nazi Germany.
Exactamente. Hay otra pregunta que plantea lo siguiente. ¿Existe el peligro de que Ucrania se transforme en una nueva Siria? ¿Una guerra larga y desgastadora?
I think this can be a very long and varying war, because this country, the Ukrainians, will be defending their country till their death. And even if Russia tries to do some kind of occupation, how can you get that bubbling under control? You will never get that place under control, because you're trying to take something that wants to be independent. And because Putin went in this maximalist positions, it's not even as in the case when Stalin went to Finland in the Winter War of 1939, where after a while, you know, when the resistance was too strong, he stepped back. He took some territory, the territory closest to St. Petersburg and in the very far north. But, you know, after a couple of months, you know, you got to a ceasefire and armistice at that point. But this is different, because for Putin, this is existential. He said it's existential. He believes that Ukraine is part of the Russian nation. And so if you are saying that it's existential for you, and for when the Ukrainians say for them it's existential to defend their country, they will fight tooth and nail, and we can watch this unfold over, I think, a long time. And that's, I think, is so unfortunate. After what seemed like a 30-year peace now, looking back, we might be now in a long period of war, plus on top that we might have a much bigger problem on our hands beyond this very specific region, which already in and of itself is a huge problem.
Hay una pregunta más bien técnica, que es la siguiente. ¿Rusia ha desplegado realmente toda su fuerza militar o realmente está teniendo problemas logísticos?
Russia having logistical problems? Yes, I can answer that question. Yes, what we are seeing, and that is very interesting, that clearly Russia miscalculated that it could do this very quick special operation, that it could sell this special operation to its people. It wouldn't become a big messy affair. They would quickly change the government, get control of the country, the Ukrainians would be welcoming them, and that, you know, however it pans out, Russia could wrap this up. But it didn't work out that way. And in every war, after several weeks, once you have made your initial advances, you need to get food, you need to get petrol, you need to get troops back to the front, you need to constantly replenish and reinforce the front line in order to be able to move further forward. And we are seeing that Russia, now when we are coming to this moment when this needs to happen, is having real problems. And we see this especially also on that move onto Kiev, where on top of everything else, also in terms of, you know, the geography, with the Ukrainians having flooded the terrain and the terrain being completely muddy, you can't actually move forward with the tanks. They have, you know, exploded their bridges. There's lots of other problems on top of what I have already mentioned. And furthermore, what seems striking is not just the quite big losses. If we are to believe that there was this moment when somehow official Russian figures seem to have gotten to the Russian press for a couple of hours, they said something like 9,800 dead and 16,000 casualties, roughly in that ballpark were the figures. And of course, we cannot verify but they were certainly higher than what were estimates, and this came from the Russian media before it got quickly deleted. You know, that within weeks is really quite shocking. If you compare to the Vietnam War, you think 50,000 American dead over many years, and that was considered shocking, then it's actually shocking to what's happened to the Russians in that short period. And then remember that a lot of the men in the maneuvers initially as part of this amassing of the troops were conscripts. You have 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, young men, perhaps the age of you students who may be watching this, you know, the Twitter generation, they're also modern, and now they're in a war. In a war they don't know what for they're fighting. Some even didn't know what they were going to do there. And that is clearly all part of this miscalculation that from the Russian perspective, you can do this fast. And instead we now get, you know, these Russian press conferences where the Russians get told everything is on track, it's going perfectly well.
Bueno, sin duda que este es un tema que podríamos seguir abordando durante mucho tiempo más, pero sabemos que el tiempo también nos pone límites. Y en ese aspecto, por nuestra parte, solamente nos queda agradecer sinceramente a la doctora Kristina Spohr por su tiempo, por su disposición. Sabemos que ya son pasadas las 10 de la noche en Londres y ha tenido un día largo. También quisiéramos agradecer a todos los que nos han acompañado esta tarde. Les agradecemos por participar de estas actividades del Observatorio de Asuntos Internacionales en conjunto con el área de Extensión Cultural. Y obviamente los queremos dejar invitados a las próximas actividades que vamos a ir informando oportunamente. Doctor Spohr, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde.
Thank you very much for this. Really, I was really honored to be able to talk to you in Chile. And I thank the technical team. I thank you, Alberto, for this wonderful moderation and conversation. I really enjoyed it. And it was very nice to be able, with this technology, to connect to the other side of the world behind the Andes. You know, right. A place that I really admire and hope to visit at some point again. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Gracias a usted, y efectivamente esperamos tener otra oportunidad de poder conversar con usted, quizá incluso acá en Chile.